This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. For years, one question has repeatedly surfaced whenever the story of Jeffrey Epstein is discussed. Who actually visited his private island? Little St. James, located in the U.S. Virgin Islands, was purchased by Epstein in 1998. Over the following decades it became one of several residences connected to his lifestyle, along with homes in New York, Florida, and New Mexico. Because of the island's isolation and privacy, it later became one of the most scrutinized locations in the entire Epstein investigation. But identifying visitors is far more complicated than it might appear. Unlike hotels or commercial properties, private estates do not maintain publicly accessible guest registries. Visitors may arrive through a combination of private flights, charter aircraft, and boats, leaving behind only partial documentation of their travel. As a result, investigators and journalists attempting to answer the question of who visited the island have had to rely on indirect records. Several different types of documents have helped reconstruct a partial picture. The most widely known are private flight logs associated with aircraft used by Epstein and his associates. These logs recorded trips between locations such as New York, Palm Beach, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Because Little St. James has no runway, travelers usually flew into St. Thomas, the closest major airport, before continuing to the island by boat. This travel pattern made St. Thomas an important gateway in understanding potential visits. However, appearing in a flight log does not automatically confirm that a passenger visited the island itself. A person arriving in St. Thomas could have stayed elsewhere in the Virgin Islands or traveled onward to another destination. Flight records therefore provide clues, not definitive proof. Other sources also contribute to the documented record. Court filings, sworn testimony, investigative journalism, and civil litigation have all referenced travel connected to Epstein's properties. When these sources are compared with transportation records, researchers can sometimes identify patterns of movement between locations. Together, these documents create what investigators often describe as a fragmented timeline. Certain trips are clearly documented. Others remain uncertain, and some may never be fully reconstructed due to the private nature of the travel involved. Understanding these limitations is essential. Being listed in a travel record does not imply wrongdoing, and many individuals whose names appear in documents connected to Epstein have never been accused of any criminal activity. The records simply show that travel occurred. Yet despite these limitations, the available documents provide an important starting point for understanding who may have visited the island over time. Because once the records are examined closely, patterns begin to emerge. And those patterns start with the flights. One of the most discussed sources in the investigation of Jeffrey Epstein's travel network is a collection of private aviation flight logs. These documents, recorded by pilots during routine operations, became central to efforts by journalists and investigators attempting to understand who may have traveled with Epstein over the years. Flight logs are standard records in aviation. Pilots typically document the date of a flight, the departure and arrival airports, flight duration, and sometimes the names or initials of passengers. These records are maintained for operational and regulatory purposes, not for public disclosure. However, in Epstein's case, several sets of these logs eventually became part of legal proceedings and investigative reporting. The flights connected to Epstein's aircraft frequently moved between a small number of destinations. Common routes included New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Because Epstein owned multiple residences in these locations, investigators later examined the travel patterns between them. When the logs became public through civil litigation and media reporting, they drew immediate attention. Some entries included the names of passengers who had flown on Epstein's planes. Because several of those individuals were public figures, the records quickly generated widespread speculation about who had traveled with him and why. But interpreting these documents requires caution. A flight log showing a person's name does not automatically confirm that the individual visited Little St. James. In most cases, flights to the U.S. Virgin Islands landed at Cyril E. King Airport in St. Thomas, the main airport serving the region. From there, travelers could continue to many different destinations. St. Thomas itself is a popular tourist destination, and nearby islands host numerous resorts, marinas, and private residences. A passenger arriving there might never travel to Little St. James at all. Another complication is that flight logs are sometimes incomplete. Names may be abbreviated, misspelled, or omitted entirely. In some entries, passengers are recorded only by initials. In others, individuals may appear on the log even if they changed plans or did not ultimately board the flight. Because of these limitations, investigators often treat flight logs as indicators rather than proof. They provide valuable clues about who traveled within Epstein's network and when those trips occurred, but they cannot by themselves confirm the purpose of the visit or the final destination of every passenger. Even so, the records revealed something important. They showed that Epstein maintained an active travel schedule linking his various properties across the United States and the Caribbean. The frequency of those flights suggested that movement between these locations was a regular part of his routine. And in many of those journeys, other people were present. Understanding who those individuals were, and how their travel connected to Epstein's properties, became the next focus of investigators and journalists. While flight logs provided the first clues about who may have traveled within Jeffrey Epstein's network, additional information emerged from another important source: court records. Civil lawsuits and legal proceedings connected to Epstein produced thousands of pages of documents, including depositions, affidavits, and sworn testimony. These records gradually expanded the public understanding of Epstein's activities and the locations associated with them. In many legal cases, witnesses are required to provide detailed statements under oath about their experiences and observations. These depositions can include descriptions of travel, meetings, and events that occurred over specific periods of time. Within the Epstein-related litigation, some of these statements referenced trips to multiple properties connected to him. Those properties included residences in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. In certain testimonies, witnesses described traveling between these locations or attending gatherings at one or more of them. Occasionally, the island of Little St. James appeared in these accounts. Because the island had already drawn attention through the flight logs, any mention of it in legal documents quickly attracted interest from investigators and journalists. When testimony referenced travel to the U.S. Virgin Islands, researchers often compared those dates with flight records in an attempt to identify overlapping timelines. This process allowed investigators to reconstruct parts of the travel network. For example, if a flight log showed Epstein's aircraft arriving in St. Thomas on a certain date and a deposition mentioned a trip to the Virgin Islands during the same period, the two records could potentially support each other. However, legal testimony also requires careful interpretation. A deposition represents the account of a witness, and in many cases multiple witnesses may describe events differently. Courts evaluate these statements through cross-examination, supporting evidence, and legal procedures designed to test their accuracy. For researchers studying Epstein's network, the value of these documents lies in the patterns they reveal. When multiple records, such as flight logs, testimony, and property timelines, align with one another, they can provide stronger indications of where certain individuals may have traveled and when those trips occurred. Still, even with extensive legal documentation, the record remains incomplete. Private travel arrangements, informal gatherings, and movements between islands often leave limited official documentation. As a result, many trips connected to Epstein's properties can only be partially reconstructed from the available evidence. Yet the combination of aviation records and sworn testimony has helped investigators build a clearer picture of the people who moved within Epstein's circle. And once those names began appearing in documents, public interest intensified. As flight logs and court documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein entered the public record, investigative journalists began examining them in detail. Reporters from several major news organizations reviewed thousands of pages of legal filings, aviation records, and property documents in an effort to understand how Epstein's travel network functioned. Their approach relied heavily on cross-referencing different sources. Flight logs might show a trip to the U.S. Virgin Islands on a particular date. Journalists could then compare that date with deposition transcripts, court filings, or other records that referenced travel during the same time period. When two or more sources aligned, researchers were sometimes able to reconstruct portions of the timeline. This method gradually revealed patterns. Epstein's aircraft frequently traveled between the same group of destinations: New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and St. Thomas. These locations corresponded closely with the properties he owned or used regularly. Because St. Thomas served as the primary airport for visitors traveling to Little St. James, journalists often treated flights to that destination as potential indicators of island visits. But again, the distinction between possibility and certainty remained crucial. St. Thomas is a major Caribbean travel hub. Visitors arriving there might stay at resorts, travel to other islands, or conduct business on the mainland. The presence of a flight record alone cannot confirm that a traveler continued to Little St. James. Investigative reporting therefore focused on patterns rather than single events. If the same individuals appeared repeatedly in flight logs connected to trips to the Virgin Islands, journalists sometimes examined whether those individuals had other documented connections to Epstein's properties or social circles. This approach allowed reporters to identify individuals who appeared frequently within the travel network. However, responsible reporting also emphasized an important point. Appearing in travel records does not imply involvement in criminal activity. Many individuals listed in the logs had professional, social, or business relationships with Epstein that predated the public awareness of the allegations against him. Several of those individuals later issued public statements clarifying the nature of their contact with Epstein. Some said they had flown with him only once or twice. Others stated that their visits were related to meetings, conferences, or unrelated travel plans. These responses became part of the broader public conversation about the records. By comparing documents, statements, and travel timelines, journalists attempted to separate confirmed facts from speculation. Their work helped clarify which details could be supported by documentation and which remained uncertain. Even with extensive reporting, however, the list of confirmed island visitors remained incomplete. Private travel, informal gatherings, and undocumented boat transfers meant that not every trip left a trace in public records. Yet the documents that do exist reveal a network of movement around Epstein's properties, one that investigators and journalists continue to study. When the flight logs and legal documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein became widely known, one aspect quickly captured public attention: the names of well-known individuals appearing in those records. Because Epstein had moved within elite social and financial circles for many years, the people listed in travel documents sometimes included politicians, business leaders, academics, and celebrities. Once these records entered the public domain through court filings and investigative journalism, the presence of recognizable names sparked widespread curiosity and debate. However, understanding what these records actually show requires careful context. A person appearing in a flight log simply indicates that they were recorded as a passenger on a particular trip. It does not automatically confirm that the individual visited Little St. James, nor does it indicate involvement in any criminal activity. Many travelers listed in the documents were recorded on flights to St. Thomas, the primary airport serving the U.S. Virgin Islands. As mentioned earlier, reaching Little St. James required an additional boat journey after landing. Travelers arriving in St. Thomas could easily continue to other destinations within the region. Despite this limitation, the records still attracted intense public interest. Some individuals whose names appeared in flight logs later acknowledged that they had known Epstein socially or professionally. Others publicly stated that their contact with him had been limited or that they had not visited his island. Several individuals also clarified that their travel occurred before the full extent of allegations against Epstein became widely known. This distinction became an important part of the public conversation. Epstein had built relationships with many influential people during the 1990s and early 2000s, a period when he participated in business, philanthropic, and academic events. As a result, interactions documented in travel records often reflected social or professional connections that existed years before later investigations. Investigative journalists reviewing these records therefore focused not only on individual names but also on broader patterns. They looked for repeated travel, overlapping timelines, and connections between flights and specific locations associated with Epstein. Even so, identifying confirmed visitors to Little St. James remained challenging. Many trips involved private transportation, and not every movement left behind detailed documentation. In some cases, records contained only initials or incomplete passenger lists, making it difficult to determine exactly who was present on a particular flight. This uncertainty meant that the travel records could only provide partial answers. They revealed who traveled within Epstein's network, but not always the full story of where those travelers ultimately went. Understanding how investigators attempted to bridge that gap became the next step. After flight logs and legal documents revealed patterns of travel within Jeffrey Epstein's network, investigators and journalists faced a more difficult challenge: determining which of those trips actually led to Little St. James. Because the island has no airport, every visitor had to complete the journey in multiple stages. Most travelers first arrived at Cyril E. King Airport in St. Thomas, the primary aviation gateway to the U.S. Virgin Islands. From there, visitors typically continued by boat to reach the island itself. This extra step created a significant gap in the documentation. A flight log might show Epstein's aircraft landing in St. Thomas with several passengers on board, but the record would end there. The documents rarely included details about where those passengers traveled afterward or how long they stayed in the region. As a result, investigators had to rely on multiple sources of information to connect travel records with the island. One method involved comparing flight dates with witness testimony gathered during civil litigation. If a deposition described a trip to the island during a certain period, researchers sometimes looked for flight records showing travel to St. Thomas around the same time. When two sources aligned, they could strengthen the timeline. Another approach involved examining property records and logistical patterns. Epstein's aircraft traveled to the Virgin Islands regularly, and those trips often coincided with periods when he was known to be staying at Little St. James. Although these patterns did not confirm every visitor, they suggested that the island was frequently used as part of Epstein's broader travel routine. Still, investigators remained cautious about drawing firm conclusions. Private estates rarely maintained publicly accessible visitor logs, and transportation by private boat often leaves little official documentation. Even with flight logs and legal testimony, many trips remain only partially documented. This uncertainty explains why no single record provides a complete list of island visitors. Instead, researchers have had to assemble a patchwork of information from aviation documents, court filings, witness statements, and media reports. Each source contributes a small piece of the larger picture. Despite these limitations, certain patterns gradually became clearer. The records indicated that Epstein's travel network was active and interconnected. His aircraft moved regularly between the mainland United States and the Caribbean, and visitors often accompanied him on those journeys. Understanding how law enforcement later approached these locations provides another important part of the story. In 2019, when federal prosecutors filed new criminal charges against Jeffrey Epstein in New York, attention quickly returned to the locations connected to his life and travel network. Among those properties, Little St. James became one of the most closely examined. For investigators attempting to understand the full scope of the case, the island represented more than just a private residence. Over the years, it had appeared repeatedly in travel records, witness statements, and civil litigation. As a result, authorities considered it a potentially important location in the investigation. Shortly after Epstein's arrest in July 2019, federal agents began coordinating investigative steps involving several of his properties. These efforts included cooperation between federal authorities and local officials in the U.S. Virgin Islands, where Little St. James is located. Reports from journalists and local observers described investigators traveling to the island to conduct searches connected to the case. Such searches are a routine part of major investigations. When law enforcement believes that a property may contain evidence relevant to a criminal case, they can obtain search warrants allowing them to examine buildings, collect documents, and secure digital materials for analysis. On Little St. James, investigators focused on gathering materials that might help clarify events connected to the allegations against Epstein. Because the investigation was ongoing at the time, officials did not immediately release detailed information about what was collected during these searches. However, the presence of federal agents on the island confirmed that authorities considered it an important location within the broader case. The images that soon appeared in news reports were striking. Photographs showed investigators arriving by boat and moving through the island's buildings. For many observers, these scenes symbolized the transition of Little St. James from a secluded private estate into a place associated with a major federal investigation. The searches also highlighted the challenge investigators faced. Even when authorities gain access to a property, Reconstructing events that occurred years earlier can be difficult. Physical evidence, documents, and digital records may provide clues, but they rarely produce a complete picture on their own. Still, examining the island allowed investigators to gather additional information that could be compared with travel records and witness testimony. By combining these sources, authorities hoped to better understand how Epstein's properties were used and who may have been present during different periods. Yet before the federal case could proceed further, an unexpected development changed its course. In August 2019, only weeks after his arrest on federal charges, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. Authorities later ruled the death a suicide. The event brought the criminal prosecution against him to an abrupt end before the case could reach trial. For investigators and the public, this development had major consequences. A federal trial would likely have produced extensive documentation, including testimony from witnesses, the presentation of travel records, and the examination of evidence collected during the investigation. Such proceedings often reveal details that remain hidden during earlier phases of a case. Without that trial, many of those potential disclosures never occurred. The question of who visited Epstein's island was directly affected by this outcome. Prosecutors had been preparing to build a detailed narrative of Epstein's alleged activities, and that process might have clarified the role of several locations associated with him, including Little St. James. Instead, the investigation moved in a different direction. Although the criminal case against Epstein ended with his death, other legal actions continued. Civil lawsuits filed by victims remained active in the courts, and those proceedings continued to generate documents and testimony that contributed to the public record. These cases sometimes referenced Epstein's travel network and the properties connected to it. Meanwhile, investigative journalists continued examining the records that had already surfaced. Flight logs, court filings, and witness statements remained key sources for researchers attempting to reconstruct travel patterns within Epstein's circle. The absence of a criminal trial meant that these sources became even more important. At the same time, law enforcement authorities continued pursuing related cases. One of the most significant involved Ghislaine Maxwell, a longtime associate of Epstein who was accused of helping recruit and groom underage girls. Maxwell was arrested in 2020 and later tried in federal court. During her 2021 trial, witnesses provided testimony describing aspects of Epstein's network and the environments in which abuse allegedly occurred. While the proceedings focused primarily on Maxwell's actions, the case added further details to the broader public understanding of how Epstein's operations functioned. Even with these developments, however, the question of who visited Little St. James remained difficult to answer definitively. Travel records could show who flew with Epstein. Testimony could describe certain events. But without a full trial involving Epstein himself, some parts of the timeline remained incomplete. As the legal process continued, attention gradually shifted toward another issue: the future of the island itself. After Jeffrey Epstein's death in 2019, responsibility for managing his assets shifted to his estate. Among the properties under its control, Little St. James remained the most widely known. Because the island had become so closely associated with the Epstein investigation, questions quickly emerged about what would eventually happen to it. At the same time, the estate faced numerous civil claims filed by victims seeking financial compensation. Handling these claims required the estate to review its financial resources and determine how its assets might be used to resolve legal obligations. Large properties connected to Epstein became part of this process, including his Caribbean holdings. Little St. James and the nearby Great St. James, another island Epstein had purchased in 2016, were eventually placed on the market. Real estate listings described the islands as rare private properties located near St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. With extensive coastlines and multiple buildings already constructed, they represented significant real estate assets despite the controversy surrounding their history. Selling the islands, however, was not a simple process. Because of their connection to Epstein, the properties had gained worldwide attention. Any potential buyer would be aware that the islands were associated with one of the most high-profile criminal investigations of the decade. For this reason, discussions about the future of the islands extended beyond real estate alone. Local officials, journalists, and observers debated what redevelopment might mean for the region. Some questioned whether the islands should be transformed into new commercial projects, while others argued that their history would always remain part of public memory. In 2023, a new chapter began. Investor Stephen Dekoff, through his investment firm, purchased both Little St. James and Great St. James for approximately $60 million. The acquisition transferred ownership away from Epstein's estate for the first time since he had originally purchased Little St. James in 1998. Following the sale, the new ownership group announced plans to redevelop the islands. Public statements suggested that the long-term goal was to transform the properties into a luxury resort destination designed to attract tourism and investment to the U.S. Virgin Islands. If such redevelopment occurs, it would represent a dramatic shift from the island's previous use as private residential estates. Yet despite the change in ownership, the historical association with Epstein remains part of the island's story. For many people, Little St. James continues to symbolize the broader investigation into Epstein's network and the unanswered questions surrounding it. Those questions lead to the final part of this timeline. After years of investigation, reporting, and legal proceedings, the question remains: who actually visited Jeffrey Epstein's island? The available records provide important clues, but they do not deliver a complete list of every person who ever set foot on Little St. James. Instead, what exists today is a collection of partial records gathered from several different sources. Flight logs show passengers traveling on aircraft associated with Epstein. Court filings and sworn testimony sometimes reference trips to his properties. Investigative journalists have compared these documents in order to identify patterns and recurring names within Epstein's travel network. Together, these records form the foundation of what is publicly known. They reveal that Epstein maintained an active network of travel between his residences in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. They also show that numerous individuals, ranging from business associates to social acquaintances, appeared in transportation records connected to those trips. However, an important distinction must always be made. Being listed in a flight log or appearing in a legal document does not confirm that someone visited Little St. James, nor does it imply involvement in criminal activity. Many individuals whose names appeared in the records later stated that their interactions with Epstein were limited or unrelated to any wrongdoing. Another limitation is the nature of private travel. Visitors to Little St. James typically arrived in St. Thomas before continuing by boat. That final stage of the journey often left little formal documentation, making it difficult to confirm exactly who reached the island and when. As a result, investigators and journalists have been able to reconstruct only parts of the timeline. Some trips are clearly documented through multiple records. Others remain uncertain, supported by only a single source or an incomplete set of documents. And many visits may never appear in any public record at all. Even with these gaps, the available evidence has helped clarify the broader structure of Epstein's travel network. It demonstrates that Little St. James was not an isolated retreat but part of a larger system of properties and transportation routes that connected people across different locations. Today, the island itself has changed ownership, but its history remains closely tied to the investigation that brought it to global attention. For historians, journalists, and the public, the records surrounding Little St. James represent both evidence and mystery. A documented trail of travel that reveals part of the story while leaving other questions unanswered. And in many ways, that incomplete record continues to shape how the world understands the legacy of Jeffrey Epstein and the network that surrounded him. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public, and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.